Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our program applying the 7 steps of data analysis to produce a quantitative research study. William Bannon of StatsWhisperer here with you. Okay, now, in this presentation, we are going to review how to judge the quality and validity of a published quantitative research study. We're going to take an approach to the article with a checklist of factors that should be found, right? And we're going to reference the 7 steps as a guide to what these factors should be. We're also going to have a sample peer-reviewed article presented so we can critique this article toward illustrating this method. And you'll see, at the risk of not offending anyone else, I critique one of my own earlier articles to say what should be there that's not there right now. Now, peer-reviewed scholarly articles are a great thing, right? So we can have a lot of confidence in them, right? The findings and the content, because they're reviewed by experts in the field, right? So the peers in the peer-reviewed are the experts in the field, right? Who check out the article, they read it, they judge the quality of it, and they consider it publishable, right? And because it's blind, so it's peer-reviewed, it's blind, so the reviewers don't know who the author is. So the author could be another leader in the field or just a beginner, right? So the article will succeed or fail upon its own merit. So it's set up in a very satisfactory way. It's a very exciting premise to have these peer-reviewed articles available to us, right? It gives us the chance to be informed, right? What are the latest findings? We're scientific, right? It uses statistics and science to identify these findings, right? We can actually base our decisions, right, on evidence-based criteria, right, because of these articles. So if we have a decision to make in our practice, in care, any type of decision at all, we can make an evidence-based decision because we have peer-reviewed articles available to us, right? And again, you'll know the cutting-edge information in your field, so you can become an expert, right? Because all the information you need to become an expert is available to you through the peer-reviewed articles. So you can see these peer-reviewed articles show a great deal of promise in many different areas. Now there's a catch, right? The articles range in quality, right? As I mentioned, you can see my earlier work and compare it to my later work, and even among the author, him or herself, the article will range in quality based on experience, right? Also, the articles range in quality between the authors themselves, right? Some are excellent, some are very good, some are good, average, poor, right? So there's a wide range of quality to these peer-reviewed articles, right? Now, unfortunately, there's no key available in general to readers to identify which articles are excellent and which may be less than excellent, right? And that goes for readers, for editors, reviewers, right? So when a reader looks at the article, there's no guide for that reader to see, to check off criteria to see if the article is between poor and excellent. The same with editors. The editors may not have predetermined criteria in that manner, and the peer reviewers themselves don't actually have the type of criteria to judge, specifically the statistics and statistical methods, right? If they're actually complete and solid. It's more of a read over to get a general sense of the quality. Right? Subsequently, readers are left to wonder about the quality of the article, right? So is it poor? Is it excellent, right? Was the article statistically sound? Were the statistical methods applied right? Comprehensive, right? Effective, and correct, which would suggest that the findings are credible. So this may have happened to you if you've ever read a research article and it seems good, but you have that doubt in the back of your mind. Well, it seems good, but I'm not sure, if it really is good, right? That's a very common little doubt. So what we need is a method to systematically assess the article, especially to assess the soundness of the statistical methods, right? We need to identify the interlocking pieces needed in a research article or report. What should come first? What should come second? What should come third, right? Now, the key to this, right, is our proposed method. The key to this is having predetermined criteria. In other words, we should know what should be in that article before we read it, right? So when we pick up the article to read, we shouldn't be a blank slate, right? We should be a slate with a bunch of checkoff boxes, right? And little notations next to them saying what should be in that article. So we're not a blank slate. We know what should be there before we read it, right? So if you know the essentials that must be there and the article is missing some of the fundamentals, right, you're concerned. You say this should be there, but it's not. But if you don't have a list of those essentials and some of them are missing, it won't be a concern because you won't realize any essentials are missing because you didn't have these essentials in mind before you read the article. So that's usually where this doubt comes in. So you're not sure what should be there, then you read the article and it seems good, but you're not sure if anything's missing because you don't know what should be there before you read it. Right? Take this photo for an example. If you're an archer, or someone else is an archer, right, they see something strange. Right? As you can see, the people here, the bows have been whited out in a sense, like camouflage, so you don't see them. So the people are pointing the arrows downfield, but they're missing their bows. Now, if you're not an archer, you might just think that the people are pointing the arrows downfield, and that's fine. But if you are an archer, you realize the bows are missing, and this looks ridiculous. So based on your experience, and more importantly, based on what you know should be there, based on your experience, this looks ridiculous, but if you don't know what should be there before you look at it, it might look fine, right? So experience tells the archer to expect a bow and arrow prior to seeing this photo. So the archer knows 50% of the essentials of the bow and arrow is missing in this photo, but a non-archer might not realize anything is missing. Right, so that's the key in assessing our article, right? Our predetermined criteria, what should be there before we read it. So just like the archer who expects to see a bow and arrow, even before he or she sees the field, experience tells the researcher, specifically the researcher that knows the 7 steps, what to expect prior to reading the research article. Right? So the 7 steps of data analysis describes the necessary steps in the study. So let's consider, for example, all the work we've done already, right? Consider the interlocking steps needed to examine the dependent variable happiness. Recall our sample study 1. Okay, now, for the sake of brevity, because we already reviewed everything in depth, we're only going to review the BQ posed within each step. BQ being the big question. So here are the 7 steps of data analysis, right? So each of these we're going to consider now regarding our published article. So step 1, the study map, right? So we clearly mapped out the variable relationships we were going to examine. And you might not actually see this in a published article, but based on the description of what the study is, you should be able to fill in these boxes pretty easily, right? So we could, in a good article, we should be able to identify the predictors, hopefully the covariate variable is an independent variable, and we should be able to identify the outcome variable or dependent variable being examined. Now that sounds simple, but there are many articles where you can't actually identify that, right? So that's why we like to do this, right? Step 1, before we get to step 7, the write-up and report, right? So we do this as step 1, so by the time we get to step 7, it's very lucid. Step 2, data entry, right? Are the data entered correctly, right? And we know from our data entry that includes data cleaning, right? All those other steps within data entry that impact if the variables, the data, are in the database properly for analysis, right? Remember, so the coding, that has to be done, right? Creating the database, right? Entering the data, and then recoding and computing scales, right? All that within data entry. Now, our checks of data integrity, step 3. Now, this is the big one. Typically, almost universally, among articles, either one or all of these steps are not mentioned in the quantitative research study, right? Now, as we said, this is really where most of the work goes when you do a quantitative research study. You know, when you're using the multiple linear regression based on the assumption of equivalence of variances, right? So we know that each of these are very, very necessary. And when you simply say out loud what these checks are, it sounds kind of silly not to actually have them done and reported, right? So, 1, statistical power. Is our sample size large enough, right? 2, the many test assumptions. We saw how one outlier, 2 or 3 outliers can make the findings inaccurate, right, or wrong. 3, missing data. What's the amount of missing data? What are the patterns of missing data? How are missing data treated, right? And then 4, the measurement tools, right? So if our measurement tools, if we don't have confidence in our measurement tools, that means we're not sure if we're measuring the variables correctly. And if we're not measuring the variables correctly, then the study isn't really studying what it says it is, right? So we know these are all really important. Okay, next, univariate analysis. The big question, what is each variable like? Now, you'll find studies that also skip this too. And as we said, the inferential analysis, right, steps 5 and 6, you can't see what the variables are like individually, right? So we want them to be described by themselves. So the continuous variable, we want the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum maximum scores. The categorical variable, we want the numbers within each category and the percentages, right, within the sample. Right, next, we did bivariate analysis, the big question. What are the significant one-on-one relationships, right, between 2 variables, specifically between each predictor variable with the dependent variable, right? In other words, with each covariate variable and the dependent variable, and the independent variable with the dependent variable, right? So we want to know that dimension, right? Then, step 6, multivariate analysis. The big question is, what's the strongest relationship, right? Now you'll find a lot of papers too that do the bivariate analysis, right? So they identify the significant one-on-one relationships, but then they don't take that next step, step 6, to the multivariate analysis that identifies among the significant relationships which is the strongest, or even which is no longer significant when the influence of the other variables are considered in the regression model, right? So there we have it, analyzing the relationship between the multiple predictors with the dependent variable. Now think about our study, right? We had 3 variables. If we didn't do that multivariate analysis, one of them maybe become not significant any longer in our regression model, right? We wouldn't know that if we just ended at the bivariate analysis, step 5. Right? So think of it this way. Steps 4, 5, and 6 are a way for you to see the variables in 3D, in other words, 3 dimensions. Right? So step 4 describes the dimension of the variable by itself. Step 5 describes the dimension of the significant one-on-one relations. And step 6 describes the dimension of the strongest variable when the influence of each is considered on the dependent variable. So a paper should report all 3 dimensions. And then there's the write-up and report, right? So are the results presented at APA, AMA comprehensively? How's the literature review? How's the conclusion? And the rest that we reviewed in that context. Now, the key word here, right? We take the 7 steps of data analysis, right, our textbook, and we apply. You see, part 6 assesses the published quantitative research study, right? And we're going to apply the 7 steps to the paper used in that section, which is also in the appendix, right? So the name of that study, which was conducted by yours truly and Dr. Mary McKay, right? That's I actually learned regression the week before I published it, right? So you could understand, that maybe there's some things not in there that I know should be in there now, right? So the name of the article is Are Barriers to Service and Parental Preference Match for Service Related to Urban Child Mental Health Service Use? So the thought behind this is we're trying to explain what facilitates parents to bring their children in for mental health, sessions, right? Mental health service use. And we're wondering what's a more salient predictor? Barriers such as transportation, doubt, and so on, right? Barriers, both physical, right? Mental, all that, right? Or if they get the service they want for their child, are they more likely to bring their child to services because they're getting the service they want? And because we could do a regression, we could see if that match for service is actually stronger than the barriers when the barriers are considered, the influence of the barriers are considered on service use, right? So conceptually, sounds okay, right? So our proposed method is going to include our big if, then. So what we're saying is, what we're proposing is if each of the 7 steps are described and completed effectively within the study, right? If, then, right, the next bullet, then we can regard that published study as high quality research per se, right? This is what we're proposing. So the study map. So as we take that article, can we fit it into a study map? Can we clearly see what the predictors are, right, and what the dependent variable is? That's the big question. What are the variable relationships being examined? So we know the dependent variable, the outcome is child mental health service use. Okay? And the predictors are barriers to mental health service use and parental preference match, right, for the service they want. So in that context, the article passes our muster. Now, data entry, right? Now, are the data entered and prepared correctly? Now, this isn't described in the article. However, it really doesn't compromise the quality of the study because this is almost never described in the article, right? It's very common not to describe it, which is dangerous because then you're assuming it was done correctly. But what are you going to do? That's the way it's done, right? So data entry is not described, but that isn't a cause for worry because that's the common tendency. Now, here we go. here's a can of worms for us to open, okay? The big question, checks of data integrity. Are the data appropriate for analysis, right? If the data aren't appropriate for analysis, the analysis probably won't come out right, okay? So we have our checks: statistical power 1, test assumptions 2, missing data 3, and measurement tools 4. Right, so let's apply those to the article. So statistical power is telling us the needed sample size to detect the relationship, right? And it's not reported. So there is no power analysis reported, right, within the study. So we don't know if the sample's large enough, right, to actually detect a significant relationship between the predictors and the dependent variable. So you actually can do a power analysis on your own, right, because it's not specific to the study. It's just based on statistical power that will indicate there are enough study participants to have statistical power, but it's always nice to have it stated, stated definitively within the article. Now, here we go. Number 2, test assumptions. Now, we could probably take a hint from all the things in red here that there's a problem, right? So, are the data appropriate for analysis? 2, test assumptions. Normality. Now, don't forget, this article we're critiquing uses multiple linear regression, right? So we need to assess if the distribution for say the outcome, right, attendance and services is normal, right? However, that's not assessed, nor is it reported, right? Multicollinearity is reported, so that's good. It's actually mentioned, saying there were no problems. It didn't give a specific VIF factor, right? Which would have been better. There's no mention of homoscedasticity or linearity or outliers. And we all saw how outliers can play havoc, right, with our findings, right? So out of 5, only 1 was referred to, right? And that's very, very common. And don't forget, this is only within test assumptions. So this is just one of the 4 checks. And within that check, only 1 of the 5 assumptions were actually assessed, right? It leaves a lot of room for error, which we do not like. So we could actually put this in a checklist style, right? So if you make this a checklist style for test assumptions, there's an extra 1 box and the other box are completely, right, left undone. Now, as we mentioned, and just to mention this to death, right, those outliers, right, those are perhaps the most insidious of all these checks. And let's review that, right? So remember, 1 mischeck can cause the data to be misrepresented, in other words, wrong. So we can compare, right, the original findings first with the same findings with 6 outliers added to see what difference that makes. If you recall, right, in our study where we examined if people living with dogs had a higher mean happiness compared to people living with cats, right? So in that we saw that these were the original findings, right, which were valid checked, right, and we had confidence in them. And we saw that 47 people, the N, live with a dog and 53 live with a cat, and the mean level of happiness for the people that live with a dog is 3.02, and the mean level of happiness for people that live with a cat is 2.48. And then when we look below at the next box under the SIG, right, two-tailed, it's a statistically significant difference. So that's our official finding, right? And we're fine with that. However, recall, if we just added 3 outliers to the dog group and 3 outliers to the cat group, right? So we added 3 high outliers, right? And 3 low outliers. And what do we see? The means become much more similar just based on 3 outliers in each group. which means if these were your findings and you didn't check for outliers, you would think these are the actual valid means. You don't realize that there's 3 outliers in each group skewing the distribution. And then when we look at the bottom, the second box, we can see the finding is no longer statistically significant. So what's happened here? Our finding of statistical significance has now been masked by 3 outliers in each group to make it look like there is not a statistically significant relationship, right? So the outliers, just a few, are hiding the real findings, right? And we would not know that, right? We wouldn't know that unless we check for outliers. So if the researcher did the analysis with the 3 outliers in each group, the second t-test, if the influence of the outliers was not examined, the true relationship would be hidden, right? A few outlier scores can easily make, right, the relationship here either look significant when it's not, or look not significant when it really is. So moving on to the next one, right? Part 3 of our checks of data integrity, right? We saw for missing data, we need to assess how much data are missing, right? So if we have 100 people, right, is one person missing data or are 50 people missing data? And how much data is missing per person? Is it 1 item per person or is it 3 items per person? Is it half of the items per person, right? That makes a huge difference, right? Because then the studies, right? And we also said, what are the patterns to the missingness, right? Are there bias regarding the missing data? So if we're looking at child mental health service use, right, is there missingness due to some factor that's also related to the outcome mental health service use, right? We need to know all that, to know if all groups are being represented, to know if it's really generalizable to the full study population, right? And how are the missing data points treated? Recall, we went through the mean imputation, right? When people just put in the means when they're missing data. So if you don't report any of this, how do we know half the data weren't missing, right? And means were imputed for all the missing data. So half the data set is actually imputed means. We don't know that unless all this is reported, right? And lastly, right, is this just a complete case analysis where everybody with missing data was just excluded? And we talked about the danger of that because people with missing data tend to be fundamentally different than people who provide complete data, right? So none of this is mentioned in the article. So we're really not sure who's in the sample, and of the people who are in the sample, how are their missing data points treated? Right? It leaves a lot open. Then the measurement tools, right? Now, this isn't so concerning because the variables were measured with a raw number, right, in this study. So how many sessions were attended, right, 1 through 16, 0 through 16, right? And how many barriers were indicated, right? So there was no Cronbach alpha needed like for our happiness scale. So the point. If an examiner outlier scores is not reported, how can the reader be sure the findings are not misleading? So in truth, we can't, because we didn't at least talk about outliers. We don't know if the findings presented in this paper are the product of just a few outliers, right? And also, all the other checks of data integrity can easily skew the findings in the same way. And perhaps not as powerfully, but definitely can have a significant influence, right? So how can we regard the findings to be credible if these checks aren't conducted and reported? And not to bash this article, because in most of the articles, and by most I don't mean 51%, I mean perhaps 91%, in most of the articles, all these checks are not reported. And like I said before, we can't just assume that they're done, because as we saw in our assessment of checks of data integrity, there's different ways, just like accounting for missing data. There's different ways to fix, right, problems with checks of data integrity. So we can't assume they're done because we need to know if there were problems and how the problems were handled in order for us to judge if we have confidence in this article. Okay, so step 4, univariate analysis. So we can see in table 1 that each barrier to service was presented at the univariate level. And also the sum barrier scale was also presented at the univariate level. So what were they individually? And then when we sum them to make a composite of barriers, that was described too. So that was good. We also looked at the percent of parents that did and did not have their service preference matched, right? So that's very good. So the predictor variables were described in a satisfactory manner. Now, at the bivariate level, bivariate analysis, step 5, we did see bivariate analysis examining how service use was related to barriers, right? So we got that one-on-one dimension of the relationship between the predictor and the dependent variable. Then we saw bivariate analysis examining how service use was also related, right, to parents getting their preferences met. Right? So the question of significance in that dimension was answered. So that's good. Also, we had a multivariate assessment, right? So the influence of all the barriers were included on service use. And then, so they were all controlled for. And then we saw that parental preference match for service was related to service use and remains statistically significant. So the question of what was the strongest relationship is also addressed. Right, so summing up the published article. So what we need is a definitive conclusion regarding the overall quality of the article. Right? Now, as we'll see, when we judge and discuss articles, it's never black and white, right, or good and bad, but a matter of gradation and judgment, because even the best studies have flaws, right? So you can find a flaw in almost any study. So it's not really productive just to bash an article, because if you bash an article, to death, just because it has flaws, you'll be bashing every single article to death pretty much, right? So assessing the quantitative article essentially becomes a matter of, I have some good news and I have some bad news, right? There are usually, valuable things and things we might like to change if this article, the study in the article was repeated. And that's natural and that's typically productive. Right? So consider this, okay? So we named all the things wrong, with the statistical, well, not all the things, but we named a few things wrong with the statistical analysis, right? And so we might be feeling, well, what's the value of the article here? Well, at the time it was written, there were no other studies that examined increasing mental health service use by considering the preference of users, right? Especially, parents in the context of child mental health services, right? So this is an understudied topic, right, that's of interest to a number of researchers, right? So the last time I checked the numbers, it was cited over 150 times since it was published in 2005, right? So the idea, right, and the study itself did have value and is of interest to the field, right? So that's a positive. Now, we also did see the 3 dimensions, right, of the variable relationships presented, right? Step 4, the variables were presented individually. Step 5, significant one-on-one relationships were presented. And step 6, the strongest relationship in multivariate analysis was identified. Right? So that's a strength. Now, as we said, the checks of data integrity are perhaps the most common problem, and they're either underreported or not done in many studies, right? And as we illustrated many times, just neglecting one of these checks can misrepresent the data entirely. So even though there are some strengths to the article, we can't be certain that the statistical results are not fundamentally wrong and misleading. So to reiterate, the reader cannot be certain that the results presented in any published study are not fundamentally unsound and misleading if the checks of data integrity are not conducted and reported. Right? So when we're reading an article, right, we're looking for the checks of statistical power, test assumptions, missing data, and measurement tools. If they're not reported, the findings could be a product of an error related to these checks. And I know we repeated that many, many times, right? We really want to drill that in. But if you haven't had enough, you can actually go to the newsletter on our site here titled The Most Important Questions Not Being Asked in Statistical Research for further reading about the need for the checks of test assumptions. Right now, next class, we're going to review how to create a PowerPoint presentation that will effectively present your quantitative study. We're going to detail the most crucial information to extract from the quantitative analysis to present, right? And you'll be offered the opportunity to present the study results to the class as a group or individual. All right, thank you for watching, and I will see you next class.